Bitcoin or maybe some other type of blockchain, they can have these logically centralized but decentralized control systems. How exactly do you want to build this? So one idea is that your base layer is very simple, and the other is that your base layer might be more complex. I think this is where the Muneeb school of thought and the Vitalik school of thought like diverges, right? Vitalik looked at pretty much the same opportunity. Like even when we looked at the uh, Ethereum white paper, it was like it's motivated by exact same things. The difference was in the implementation style, right? Vitalik was saying we're going to start a different blockchain, and what we're going to do is we're going to make it sort of like fully programmable and have a lot of complexity in the base layer. And my gut reaction was, hey, you might want to do the opposite, right? Because if you look at the evolution of a lot of these systems, it's time and time again, you do the complex uh, base layer, it works really well in the short term and it works really badly in the long term. And in the long term, the systems that have sort of like survived and have been category winners were the ones with very, very sort of like simple base layer.
Welcome back to the Slow Hunch podcast, where we trace the twisty paths that big breakthroughs have taken on the journey from inspiration to reality. This week, we're thrilled to be joined by Muneeb Ali, one of the co-founders of Stacks. Stacks is a project in the Bitcoin ecosystem that aims to make Bitcoin more programmable and scalable so that more kinds of applications can be built on top of it. USV backed Muneeb and his co-founder Ryan Shea back in 2014. At that time, we were all inspired by the idea that this little curiosity known as Bitcoin might be useful for a much wider variety of things than people were focused on back then. The idea that Bitcoin and other blockchains could be not just the foundation for a next generation of finance, but also for a next generation of the internet itself. On this episode, we'll dig into both Muneeb's personal story from his PhD in computer science at Princeton to his work on Bitcoin and Stacks today, and we'll explore this slow hunch that's continuing to unfold today right in front of us about how Bitcoin and other blockchains can continue to be more and more useful for an ever-expanding set of both financial and computing use cases. Awesome. Well, I'm so happy to talk to you today, and I've been really looking forward to this. I wanted to talk to you about a really big idea that you've been working on for the last decade or maybe more. I'll let you describe it in your own words, and then we can maybe get into the story, the story, your story, and the story.
If you look at Stacks, we basically describe it as it's a Bitcoin L2. And layer 2s or L2s are the only way to scale Bitcoin to 1 billion plus users, right? So if you really want to get mass adoption, like internet scale adoption for a decentralized technology like Bitcoin, this is sort of like the only way it's going to happen, right? So in some ways, we're trying to scale out Bitcoin not just for payments, but for all sorts of applications. I think the broader version of this is more like enabling a decentralized internet. And I think Bitcoin, it happens to be our choice for the foundation, just like TCP/IP is for the current internet or Web2, so to speak. The idea is like there could be a decentralized internet where users are more in control, so people like giving power to the people. And over the years, we have sort of narrowed down to Bitcoin being the foundational layer of it. I think if you look at my story arc, in the 2000s, I was actually doing research on peer-to-peer systems. Always was fascinated by it. Was sort of like looking at decentralized storage, like decentralized identity, also sorts of like these decentralized things you can do with peer-to-peer networks. Just intellectually fascinated by it. For a frame of reference, people should think of Napster, right? Napster is the most popular peer-to-peer sort of like a thing, and compare Napster to like a Spotify or some other centralized version, right? So I was always interested in building the Napsters of the world. Like, how do you just enable people to come together and sort of in a decentralized way and do that? And I, frankly, like when I started my PhD around 2008, by that time, the research in peer-to-peer systems was sort of like dying, right? And the reason was that these systems turned out to be very hard to commercialize. Very few of them actually reached like mass adoption. Like I think BitTorrent might be one of the few examples. I think they were also just from purely technical basis, they were very hard to build and just function. Like the base level functionality would be so hard to achieve. So I think just from a, I would say, other than the commercial reasons, which I agree with, like sometimes purely the technology was not even doing its job. Money sort of like follows where more users are or more commercial success is. So one of the interesting things that started happening was there was so much capital thrown into the area of research and development for data centers, which were data centers were always more centralized, like Google and Facebook's were using it. That even in academia, even in the research circles that I was in, a lot of people just started doing research there, not only because they saw like real applications, but also a lot of capital was coming in, like the capital. And and I, looking back, that was an area that I just intellectually was not interested in, right? Like so I'm a PhD, I'm a first year PhD student. A lot of the projects that are happening are for data centers, and that's my background. Like that's the natural fit for me to go. And just the idea of like building some sort of a fast distributed system that would get deployed at Google just didn't fly with me, right? So imagine me where there are lots of opportunities to do work in data centers. I'm sort of avoiding it, not doing it, but at some point I have to finish my PhD as well. So I'm writing this thesis which is around these large scale database systems and so on. And I this is supposed to be my last year of PhD, 2013, and I'm completely, frankly, sort of like checked out. Like I don't even want to apply for a faculty position. I'm not excited by the actual thesis I'm doing. I'm sort of doing it to wrap it up, and I'm also a bit jaded by academia at this point, right? Like I'm like, hey, I want to go and build stuff and have more direct commercial impact. So I'm almost like plotting to do startups, and that's where I meet my co-founder Ryan Shea. He was undergrad at Princeton. I was doing my PhD there, and we sort of decided that hey, we don't know what exactly we want to build, but we like each other. How about we try to hack on certain things? So I take a leave in my last year. It's almost like PhD was a backup, right? I'm gonna go try to hack on certain things, and if it doesn't work out, go back, submit my thesis, and then see if I want to get a job or something like that. That's really how I was thinking. So this is 2013, and we are just hacking on random ideas. And me and Ryan, we were in a co-working location in East Village, and we were literally hacking on multiple ideas, right? Like it's like just try things out. But we end up talking about Bitcoin so much that everyone in the co-working location thought we are a Bitcoin startup.
The mind virus, it takes over. Yeah.
Like how like Paul Graham says, or I think Chris Dixon also says, what people are doing over nights and weekends is where the real signal is. So even though we had the freedom to hack on whatever, for some reason, we didn't see like building on Bitcoin as like a very serious thing. It was sort of like a hobby. It was just interesting for us. We were talking about it, and at some point, I actually remember that enough people pointed out that, hey, you guys are passionate about this. You're always talking about this. Why don't you explore building something here? Because you're exploring stuff anyway. And I remember like it was almost like external push a little bit. Like it makes sense. Like why don't we explore more? So the thing that I loved about Bitcoin is like connecting the previous decade to this is so early 2000s I did peer-to-peer networking research, then was sort of like pulled into data centers, didn't enjoy it, um, and I look at Bitcoin, and it literally solves the problem that the peer to peer systems had, which made them inferior to the data centers. And that was the aha moment. I think that was the key aha moment where I think the way Albert described it in a blog post is it's logically centralized, but with decentralized control. So the thing that made the data centers superior was that it was centralized. So everything is again, imagine a like a key value store, right? Let's say there are thousand entries in the key value store. Every time you query this like a memcache running on a Google server, you will get the results back because Google knows all the thousand entries. You put the same thousand entries in a peer-to-peer system, and they might be distributed. A node might be offline. You're trying to query it. You're not even getting your results back, right? But what Bitcoin does is that yes, it might be slow, but it converges on a logically centralized full view. Like it's basically called global state. And peer-to-peer systems never had global state. And that was the aha moment that, oh, we can actually retain all the nice properties of the decentralized peer-to-peer world and have this one missing thing that like actually two things. One is like, hey, you have this view. The second thing is going to be performance. Like Bitcoin is, performance wise much slower, much harder to scale. And I think in some ways, the next 10 years we've just been working on the performance issue. Like how do we scale this out? How do we make it possible that millions or hundreds of millions of people can come and actually use these systems?
What you just said about the big unlock about something, a decentralized system being able to be logically centralized but decentralized control was such a profound is such a profound idea, and it was the unlock for us at USV. And the blog post you're talking about, Albert wrote in 2013 called Bitcoin as Protocol. We had been looking at Bitcoin as the vision of Bitcoin originally was internet money or internet gold, digital cash. But then the more we looked into it, the more we came to the exact same conclusion you did, which was no, wait a second, this is a more generalizable system for solving the problem of the thing that decentralized systems couldn't do before, which is have shared state, a single source of truth, ground truth across the entire universe in a decentralized way. And that once you have that, you could potentially build anything on it, not just
Yes.
money.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of like the exciting part moment, and we started. Um, I think we could have started anywhere, but we started with this idea of like, hey, let's try to build
Yep.
usernames or domain names, and the idea was, look, this is the thing that people are used to using on the traditional internet. So how about we give people their usernames? They can maybe use that to log into stuff, and that was sort of like the beginning, right? So the one name app, right? So I think of one name as like a probably the earliest, if not one of the earliest applications built on Bitcoin directly. And it was clearly non financial. We didn't even have a name for this, right? Like we were calling, I think when we came and talked to you guys, we were calling it non financial use cases of blockchain, right? And now turns out like non financial use cases are basically smart contracts and NFTs. And like that area is probably bigger than payments.
Potentially. And if you think about Bitcoin as the infrastructure for sort of a new internet, which is I think another way that you've always described it. The internet is a platform for financial use cases, but it's also a platform for everything from media to social interactions to sort of identity. And I think the idea that Bitcoin and blockchains could serve all of those functions was like just a really really big idea. And when we met you in 20 at end of 2013 or maybe middle of 2014, um, you were going sort of straight at it with the idea of usernames as the place to start, right? Because it kind of just makes sense, right? Like the username is sort of the foundation for everything else. And so that seemed like a natural place to start at the time.
At this point, let's call it 2014, we've sort of converged on this idea that these type of systems, call it Bitcoin or maybe some other type of blockchain, they can have these logically centralized but decentralized control systems. And that's super exciting to me because I'm passionate about peer-to-peer systems. But now I feel like, hey, now we can compete with the data centers. Right? Like now, finally, we have a shot. Now we can actually build systems that can give users the same sort of like UX or performance that they're looking for. So that's exciting. Now you enter like phase two, which is a step deeper. That how exactly do you want to build this? Like now you sort of like get into the architecture or design of it, and it's very interesting. Like I think it's sort of like at a high level. I think there were sort of like two paths. One is that your base layer is very, very simple. And this is again a debate we have seen in computer systems for decades, like literally decades. And I'll give you examples as well. Right. So one idea is that your base layer is very simple. And the other is that your base layer might be more complex. I think this is where the Muneeb school of thought and the Vitalik school of thought like diverges, right? And it's sort of like pretty interesting fork, right? And over there, I think what Vitalik looked at pretty much the same opportunity. Like even when we looked at the uh, Ethereum white paper, it was like it's motivated by exact same things. Like it was pretty much exactly the same thing. The difference was in the implementation style, right? Vitalik was saying we're going to start a different blockchain, and what we're going to do is we're going to make it sort of like fully programmable and have a lot of complexity in the base layer. And my gut reaction was, hey, you might want to do the opposite, right? And here's the reason why. Because if you look at the evolution of a lot of these systems, it's time and time again, you do the complex uh, base layer, it works really well in the short term and it works really badly in the long term. And in the long term, the systems that have sort of like survived and have been category winners were the ones with very, very sort of like simple base layer. And the examples would be one is the internet itself. Like back in 90s, there were multiple different designs. TCP/IP is the most simple format that, hey, here's the base protocol, very, very simple. You can build more complexity on top of it. There were much more complex network designs. They were trying to do a lot of complex logic at the routing layer and keeping state there and whatnot. Whereas TCP/IP is sort of like, hey, simple base layer. We're just going to move the packets. Other things can be built on top. A lot of people might not remember this, but back in the day, even Unix was a controversial idea because most of the intellectual capital was working on this system called Multinix from MIT, which is a more complex base system. And then Unix was these people in New Jersey, and they're like, hey, who knows what they're doing? And they came up with, no, we're going to build like a very, very simple sort of like primitives, and you can build more complex things on top. And now nobody has ever heard of Multinix, right?
And your point about durability and time is a really important one, right? So I think the TCP or IP protocol were developed, in the mid 70s, give or take, and you didn't get the web, sort of HTTP and websites until the early 90s. So there's sort of a 20-year period of development on top of a core set of protocols that ended up
Right.
coming in a very layered form, and that architecture has proved correct, I think, in the internet, and very durable. And I guess to take that as an analog, we're still in the figuring it out phase when it comes to blockchains, and which will ultimately be the dominant architecture because Ethereum did launch. A lot of stuff has been built on it. It's been very expressive and very interesting. Bitcoin has always stayed steady, stable, simple. Um, but now in the last few years, it's been possible to keep building new layers on top of Bitcoin the way you're doing. And, thanks to a few other things that I think have sort of opened up that opportunity space over time.
But if you fast forward literally 10 years, so 2014 to 2024 now, and you look at the landscape of now the opportunity is much more clear. Now people are calling this is Web3, a decentralized web. It is the like north of a almost like a $2 trillion industry at this point. It's real, right? Like the stuff is happening. There are literally, I would say, hundreds of projects, but at least I would call like 20, 30 like really highly skilled teams with hundreds of millions of dollars of capital raised that are running after sort of like the same opportunity, right? And I don't think it will converge to like just one winner, but it's entirely possible that 10 more years from now or something, there's enough consolidation that there may be two, three main winners in the categories, which usually always happens, right? Like if you look at Web2, even if you look at technologies before. So the $1 trillion question that everyone sort of like asks is which design and which projects, what's going to happen, right? So the lay of the land in 2024 is there are three schools of thought. One again is the Vitalik school of thought, which has evolved now, right? So Vitalik, like at some point, I think me and him used to argue on Twitter about some of these things about sharding and scaling L1s that way. I was like, never going to happen. And now Vitalik's thinking has evolved to, okay, maybe L1 is not going to scale. They've dropped sharding, and now they're coming to the L2s, which I think is more in line with sort of like what I've always believed in. And it's like, okay, you're going to build these layers on top of Ethereum, and L2s is where everything's going to happen. Like they call it a roll-up centric approach or whatever name you have. But the idea really is that Ethereum might have to provide a basic set of services, and then everything else is going to be built on top. Right. That's one school of thought. The other one is actually, let's call it, Tolly's school of thought from Solana, who is still saying, hey, no, we can have enough complexity just in a single layer, and everything's sort of like synchronous, and and that's needed for certain applications. And that's, I think that's still interesting. I think there's some interesting ideas there. I wouldn't dismiss it at this point. And I think they're doing an interesting work, and there are other projects that are sort of like saying, hey, it's not going to be Ethereum, it's going to be us, but because of this reason or that reason, right? Like, but I will generally, let's call Solana the category, the leader in this category of not Ethereum but some other L1.
Sort of full stack, simple, and then maybe some questions about ultimate scalability, something like that.
Scalability or centralization, and so on, right? So those are two big categories. To give people an idea of even the size of it, the ETH L2s are basically, depends on how you count it, but 80-90 billion-dollar market right now, right? There's trading, there are 20 plus projects who are trying to build these ETH L2s, and these alt L1s are probably north of 100 billion category, right? There's Solana, there's Avalanche, there's new ones coming, pretty large sort of like categories, and people are trying to build there. And I think then there's the third category, which is where we have always been standing, and it is that the base layer is going to be Bitcoin, and there is going to be Bitcoin L2s.
Right. And I would say that category didn't really exist as a meme until rather recently.
Yeah, within the last year, 6 months, 8 months, or something. And now let's call the category, it's a $4 billion, $5 billion category, and 3 billion of that is Stacks right now. So we're sort of like the market leader, but now tons of new projects are starting, right? So the rate at which I think Bitcoin L2s are being built is actually faster than even if ETH L2s were being built. If you go back like a couple of years, the amount of funding that's happening, the devs that are coming, like the projects, the numbers just keep going up, right? Like the last I heard was 50 new projects are launching. Obviously, not all are going to be high quality, but it's a very rapidly growing category. And I think it, like looking at like, call it like 4 or 5 billion category right now, people see a clear path to this could be 100 billion plus category, right? And that's why a lot of attention is coming in. And those are the three big categories for where this new decentralized web would end up being built. Like, not that other things are going to disappear, but what's going to be the dominant one? Like when we go to a billion users, where would most of those users actually be?
Yeah, and maybe that's a good segue to kind of go back to the slow part of the hunch, because this idea of a layered architecture and L2s is sort of a new idea in the meme space for Bitcoin. It's let's call it an established idea in Ethereum, for the last like 4 or 5 years. But then it's also basically the subject of your thesis that you wrote back in 2017, that was focused on Bitcoin. And so, what did you see then that made that so clear to you? And then maybe we could also talk about what has taken it a while to kind of come to fruition.
Let's go back 10 years now, 2014. And Ethereum was the main other project that was starting at that time. I think we were slightly early, and Ethereum is sort of like saying, hey, we'll build a pretty complex base layer. We're going to have full programmability, and we're going to go out and do this. On our side, we're working with Bitcoin, which has extremely limited scripting language, and we're like, we'll try to build some base primitives on the base layer, and then we'll have these other layers, like maybe data storage as a layer or other types of the things out there. And we tried building directly on Bitcoin and felt the pain, right? Like it's really hard to build on Bitcoin L1, right? To give you like a idea, the block times are like 10 to 40 minutes, and the scripting language is extremely limited. And even when you build something that gets usage, like we built this. So people might be familiar with like .eth names on Twitter. Uh, BNS predates it, so we built the Bitcoin name system before it on Bitcoin. It's still in use. Like I think there are some like 250,000 registered names. You might still see them on Twitter here and there. It's kind of cool that it predates ENS. It's still in active use. But our system was doing at some point between 40 to 60% of Bitcoin traffic globally. And core devs are yelling at us that, hey, Bitcoin is never meant to do these things. What are you guys doing? We can barely scale payments. And there's also like this cultural clash a little bit, right? Like the Bitcoin dominant culture, even though a lot of innovation has happened on Bitcoin, like NFTs started on Bitcoin as counterparty, uh, ICOs started as colored coins on Bitcoin, stable coins started with Tether on Omni layer on Bitcoin. But there is this culture of like, hey, Bitcoin is sacred. Don't try to mess with it too much. Don't try to build these things, and people are to push you out. Versus Ethereum, I think to Vitalik's credit, had this extremely developer friendly, experimentation friendly thing. No idea is too weird. Like go and like try it out, right? And build these things. So I think the next, I would say, important year is going to be 2017. Like it was a pretty important year in the history of blockchains and even my personal journey as well. So what happened in 2017 is a couple of things. A, Ethereum went from sort of like, the big boys would sort of like laugh at it that, hey, this is such a crazy thing. It's just never going to work.
It can't possibly work. I heard a lot of people say that it just couldn't possibly work.
All of those things. So I think Ethereum graduated from that, and I think it had some early problems with the DAO hack and this and that in 2016. But by 2017, people were like, "No, this thing is kind of working, right? And it's actually getting traction." And CryptoKitties was launching there, and Ethereum is now facing its own scalability issues, but it has enough momentum that look, this thing sort of works. Bitcoin is going through a civil war, right? The big blocks versus small blocks, the forks that were happening in Bitcoin. It was a pretty intense thing for the Bitcoin community. And I was on the small block side because I believe in a simple base layer. But interestingly, what happened was most of the people who wanted to build stuff on Bitcoin, they were in the big blocks camp because they wanted more data and more sort of like things to do at the L1. So I was in the small block thing because I thought things should be built on top, not at the base layer. And the small blocks ended up winning, but it wasn't clear to me at that time that how large of an impact is going to have on the Bitcoin culture, because because of the fork, everyone who was supportive of building application on Bitcoin actually got kicked out. They got kicked out of Bitcoin, right? And Ethereum was absorbing people with open arms, and everybody come here, build here. And that I think I didn't even fully realize how impactful the year 2017 was going to be. And on the personal journey side, I think we realized that L1 is not going to scale. We were going to almost like sunset or migrate the one name application that got some early traction. And I took a little bit of a time to go back and actually finish my thesis, like mostly for my parents, right? Like they were worried about my life. What am I doing? Like, at least finish your PhD, right? Princeton was very supportive that because we published some of this work as well. So they were like, take that research paper, expand it, and write it as a thesis. So I ended up doing like a different thesis from the original 2013 one. This one on blockchains, this one on really Bitcoin as the basis for a decentralized internet. And I think if this idea ever ends up becoming something, I think at some point people will go back and read the 2017 thesis and be like, oh, all the roots of the ideas were there. That Bitcoin is going to be the basis for a decentralized internet. This is how it's going to scale. This is what the architecture might look like, and so on.
I mean, that's such an interesting moment. You know, the Bitcoin civil war, big blocks versus small blocks, and the idea that the builders were basically kicked out, right? And yet, somehow at that moment, you shared the vision of building on Bitcoin, but you were not flushed out. You were not scared away. In fact, you went the opposite direction and doubled down. That must have been hard, because you must have felt sort of all alone. And what enabled you to keep the sort of resolve and commitment to that idea during that time?
I think that's a very interesting question. So I would say, so this is the thesis got done summer of 2017, graduated, and then we sort of like, I think we effectively started a new project, but we kept the cap table from the original company, instead of like just starting a new company and so on. And we did a fundraise for Stacks. So if you read the Stacks original paper, it's very clear about, hey, this is a sort of like, I think we were calling it a Bitcoin layer, not a layer two, but Bitcoin layer L2, and Lightning was starting at the same time, right? So Lightning started around the same time. So I would say the two largest Bitcoin L2s that are running today, they were effectively started late 2017. And we did a fundraise, raised around $50 million. And I think at that point, we were actually feeling a little left behind from Ethereum, because in our minds, like 2016 Ethereum was pretty crappy, right? So we only have like 6 to 9 months of traction data on Ethereum. They, hey, look, this thing is trading at a high market cap. It's getting a lot of developers, getting a lot of users. So we are feeling a little behind. Right? We didn't realize like how quickly Ethereum is going to become sort of like the giant that it did become. And we are like, let's raise capital, and we are going to do R&D and basically do everything better than Ethereum, right? So if we don't like their programming language, we're going to come up with a more safe programming language. If we don't like the way Ethereum is going to scale, we're going to come up with our consensus algorithm that's going to do this and that. And I think that's where I would say we underestimated the fast growth of Ethereum, and then also the other projects that were coming in to build a better Ethereum. Right. So the competitive landscape like drastically, I would say drastically changed. And I would say that the pain points of building on Bitcoin is what we experienced really in the years after 2017. Let's go into 2018 now. So 2018, we're already seeing projects that are coming in saying, hey, we'll scale Ethereum. Right? We'll build L2s on top. There are already projects that are coming in and saying we will build different L1s. Right? Algorand, Avalanche, I think even Solana early 2018 did their round. And then here we are, Lightning and Stacks sort of saying, hey, we're going to build on Bitcoin. So interesting. And we've seen sort of like, I would say, massive growth on the Ethereum side because it was live, right? That was the only thing people could use. But even the L1s, I think, were able to move pretty fast. And now when I look back that, hey, why that happened, why did it take us that long to even ship the first version like in 2021, or even get as much traction and other things? We're the only ones really who are working with a legacy system. Right? And not only that we are working with a legacy system, we are actually going against the current, right? Like the Bitcoin community is fighting us. Like that's where this is the new Bitcoin community. This is all the people with ideas about, hey, you can build stuff on Bitcoin and we'll be supportive. They're gone, right? This is the new Bitcoin community, which is a bunch of podcasters and bloggers. It's not a lot of technical people, and they have this sort of like scars from the Bitcoin civil war that anyone who's trying to do anything with Bitcoin is just like bad, and it's their duty to sort of like push back on it. So so I call these the dark ages of Bitcoin. So effectively like 2018, 19, 2020, 2021 even. And I think basically building through that was probably the hardest thing. And I think we did that, but I don't even know how, but staying so like heads down, Like people are yelling at us on Twitter all the time. Like one of the comments I get the most when I go to conferences, like random people come up to me and they say, we don't like we have so much respect for you. It's also like people are just shitting on you all the time and you smile back. You very in a calm way explain like why this is a good idea, and they keep like throwing trash on you, and you sort of like keep a smile on your face and you walk away, and people see that. Like a lot of the community members in Stacks and a lot of like people I bump into at conferences, surprisingly this is the first thing they say because they've seen it so much, right? Like me getting a lot of shit from Bitcoiners, but con- basically continuing to build.
I mean, it's incredible, really, and it demonstrates um, a real commitment to the belief in the approach. What's interesting is that meanwhile, while it's true that everything was like developer oriented stuff was blowing up in these other ecosystems, Bitcoin was still the king of the hill in terms of a base layer and a financial asset and um, a capital base, right?
Yeah,
And so I imagine that was part of what helped fuel your commitment to the approach, even though it took longer for the, let's call it, the vibes to change
yeah.
towards builders.
If I would have self doubt, I would go back to first principles and look at the landscape. They're like, wait a minute, Bitcoin is still the largest asset. It is still the most secure chain, right? Like in terms of like hash power and security, it is still the best settlement layer. Like just I think yesterday I was at a place where this same argument was being discussed of the Ethereum versus Solana versus Bitcoin, and someone was saying like, hey, Ethereum is going to be the settlement layer of the world, and I raised my hand and I was like, if you settled some data on the Ethereum chain, is there any guarantee that that data would even be there 5 years from now? Because they might just clean up the history, right? And then everyone's like, "Oh yeah, maybe you're right." Right? There's no guarantee actually that what Ethereum would even look like 5 years from now, right? Or if this data would even be present. You settle something on Bitcoin, like there is a guarantee that thing is not disappearing for decades and decades to come, and I can dust off a Bitcoin software from the year I started 11 years ago, 2013, run it, and it will catch up to the chain tip even today, right? So I think those are sort of like first principles thinking that sometimes if you go back and think about it, it's like, wait a minute, this is really the actual settlement layer for a global internet because it's the only one that we know with high probability will be around. If this is not around, nothing else is around either. Like Bitcoin goes down, everything else is going down with it.
That's incredible. I think another piece probably is that Bitcoin still has by far the biggest brand recognition
Yeah.
among non-technical, non-developers, non-builders.
Yes.
Um, how much did that factor into your calculus and your thinking?
Shipping something and seeing traction for it also helps, right? So we did ship the first version of Stacks in early 2021. We saw some traction. It went up to like I think 3.5 or $4 billion in market cap. There were very interesting dynamics where STX, the asset, gives people a BTC yield, which is again a very unique thing. And the people who have experienced it, they're such die-hard believers in this because they're like, oh, I'm earning BTC, the best sort of like asset on the planet, and the developers again. I think for us, it's that slow hunch, right? Like there, we fully understand that our language is clarity is not as well known as Solidity and EVM, and the developer funnel is smaller, but the developers who actually go through the funnel, they love it. Like they wouldn't do anything else because it's a safer language. There are certain properties that they really love about it. So it's the first version of the system. Like our mempool was full most of the time, right? Like developers were launching things, and we will basically reach network capacity very quickly because we were coming from Bitcoin, and I think believed in decentralization a lot. So I think they were. I would call the year 2021 as kind of like the next um, phase where we saw enough traction to then keep us going. Like there was a very organic community of developers. There, a little bit more capital coming in, and then we saw sort of like the problems, which started seeding the design for the next iteration. that to really compete with Ethereum or Solana or other alternatives, like we need a different type of L2, right? Which is what sort of like we've been working on for the past 2 years, and we are launching this year.
So why don't we talk about that? What is next for Stacks? What are the changes that are coming right now? Why are they so important?
Yes. So I would say, given that me and other developers in Stacks, we do come from a pretty hardcore Bitcoin community. I think the lesson looking back was we gave too much importance to decentralization over UX. That was like one big lesson. And it's effectively, it's also not even that needed, because the L1 absolutely needs to be decentralized, for sure, right? The L2 can actually be a good counterpart if it optimizes for speed and UX more, even if it's slightly less decentralized. Not that I wouldn't push something which is fully centralized, but relatively speaking, right? So an example would be our first version of Stacks. People could run the nodes on Raspberry Pis, just like they can run Bitcoin nodes on Raspberry Pis. Right? So we were trying to go for Bitcoin equivalence. That hey, we are going to be as decentralized. It should be super easy to run nodes, but in reality, if they can run Bitcoin nodes on Raspberry Pis, but for Stacks nodes, you need a slightly higher powered computer. It's not the end of the world, right? Like if it can run on a normal computer or a laptop or something. Like you don't have to be on that extreme. And then there were, I do think we sort of, because we're coming from the Bitcoin world, we were used to the 10-minute to 40-minute transaction times, but Ethereum actually became a lot faster with their proof of stake upgrade, and then Solana just completely changed the game. And yes, you can criticize them that it I've heard numbers like it costs like $1 million to run a validator, or they're more centralized in certain ways, but it's fast and it's cheap, right? So that's what users care about. So I think it became like very clear to us that we need to solve this UX problem, and not only for the L2, it's actually solving the UX problem for Bitcoin. Now I see it very clearly. Why didn't Bitcoin take off as a payments thing? Like back in the day, people would talk about, hey, I'll just make my payments over Bitcoin. I think part of it is that Bitcoin community was putting all of their eggs in the Lightning uh, bucket. That Lightning is going to solve all of these problems. I think Lightning has made some progress, but some reliability and other issues sort of like remain with Lightning, and it hasn't gained as much adoption that I think people would have hoped like 5 years from now, 5 years back. And I think so that was pretty clear to us that if you can actually solve this base level challenge, that you can do a fast, cheap BTC transfer on the L2 that is completely reliable, and then somehow benefit from Bitcoin security, that would be a massive win. So this is what the Stacks Nakamoto system looks like. So instead of doing like 10 to 40-minute blocks, currently the L2 does blocks when Bitcoin does blocks, right? So that's horrible UX. Like that's pretty obvious, especially now. So now what we can do is we can do blocks. Let's call it 5 seconds, and there's no magic number of 5 seconds. It can keep getting faster because we have decoupled the L2 blocks from the L1 blocks, and there could be fast L2 consensus. So today there's something like $1 billion locked in Stacks, and they can validate the fast blocks just like Solana validators validate Solana blocks, or ETH validators validate ETH blocks. So they can validate, and for most transactions, that's more than enough, right? Like if you're doing a simple payment, $1 billion is signed off on your payment went through. For most things, it's fine. But here's the interesting part, and here's what this is different from Ethereum or Solana. As soon as a Bitcoin block comes, then the security switches to Bitcoin finality. So for someone to reverse a transaction after a Bitcoin block came, they would have to attack the Bitcoin network. Right? So I think that's a really nice property to have, because if you're doing a large transaction, you'll be like, hey, I'll just wait for a Bitcoin block.
Right. It reminds me a little bit of storing data in memory and then saving it to disk. I don't know if that's perfect,
Yeah. You
but
can do fast things, but if you want it to be durable, you write it to
you write
disk.
it to disk, and that's
Yeah,
kind of how Stacks, when the Nakamoto upgrade launches, will work. You can basically be as fast as you want in Stacks, but also have Bitcoin security, and you can
that's what.
actually time your transactions if you want to line up with Bitcoin blocks. I hadn't thought about that.
And then the interesting thing that also became clear to us is, like, imagine people today make transactions on Solana or Ethereum in tens of millions or even hundreds of millions, right?
Yep.
Like, even if someone wants to move 100 million in capital, they don't even think about the infrastructure. They attach a small fee. The transaction goes through 100% of the time, like, reliably. You can't do that on Lightning, right? You can't even do like a 10 million transaction because you need liquidity on the channels, and then who's going to put the liquidity and why. There are all sorts of like those things over here. So a basic L2 for Bitcoin, where you can do a 10 million BTC or 100 million BTC transfer without even thinking about the infrastructure, is actually a huge unlock for Bitcoin, right? And I think that's where it will bring Bitcoin back to the table for being used as payments, and doing integrations like all across the web for, simple payments. And that's where it started becoming more clear to me that the L1 was never going to scale to hundreds of millions of users on the L1. Like a billion people can't even own a UTXO for Bitcoin. So most of the users are actually going to get onboarded on Bitcoin through L2s. And that's where, we started taking hard work even more seriously, that, hey, this is the way a billion people are going to get onboarded on Bitcoin. They're going to effectively, use BTC L1 as like cold storage. Like, I keep my savings BTC there, and for anything where you're playing around with Bitcoin, be it payments, be it, taking a loan against your Bitcoin or purchasing an NFT, like, the hot wallet is your L2.
That's I mean, a terribly exciting vision. It in many ways aligns with the architecture of where the Ethereum ecosystem is now, but as we've kind of talked about, it's backed up on Bitcoin, actual Bitcoin. Um, so the Nakamoto release is goes later this summer. Is that right?
Yes.
Um,
So, yes, around, like, I think end of August or so, that goes live, and then our Bitcoin asset goes live, right? So moving BTC from L1 to L2, like, right now there isn't a good way of doing that. So we have effectively a decentralized group of signers who can help bring your BTC back from L2 to L1. L1 to L2 is easy because it's open. L2 understands what L1 is. L1 doesn't know that L2 exists, right? So Bitcoin is not fully programmable like Ethereum. I think this is where some of the Ethereum's programmability actually helps Ethereum. That, yes, it's a bigger attack vector, it's more complex, all of those things, but people can actually have more trustless L2s. And I think what we are sort of like saying is, let's build a decentralized way of doing it. And if Bitcoin can change, if we can have more opcodes in Bitcoin, let's say a couple of years from now, then we can make these L2s even more trustless. I think we had to do a lot of groundwork, or maybe you can even think of that as unnecessary work. I'll give you some examples. So some of these, I'll call them more fundamentalist Bitcoin community members, they wouldn't even host me on their podcasts. Like, they're not even willing to listen to the other opinion, right? Like, they will try to literally like censor you out. They wouldn't let me give talks at Bitcoin conferences, like, which is ridiculous, right? Like, if you have been building in Bitcoin for so long, you are one of the largest projects in the community, and you can't even go on stage to present what you're building. Like, this is like, Bitcoin is supposed to be like open and free, and people should be able to do what they want. So we had to literally start our own developer conferences. We had to start our own podcasts. We had to start our own Twitter spaces. And sometimes we would even do this, that we would have a Twitter space right next to like a big Bitcoin space, because those people are talking about the same stuff, that, hey, Bitcoin has 21 million cap, it's the best asset, it's the best asset, and it gets repetitive, right? Whereas we are talking about interesting new things, like, the future. Oh, you can program Bitcoin, you can build Bitcoin backed stable coins, you can create a circular Bitcoin economy. And slowly we started getting more audience, because I think we are on the right side of history, and just more exciting, with a path forward, versus a culture of like just saying no and staying in a very sort of like closed off loop. And I think that changed, and then ordinals helped a lot. Like ordinals on L1, sort of, because they couldn't stop it, right? And fees were going up, and when the Bitcoin fees started going up, they went up around 200x. Then L2s went from a nice to have to a medicine to a pain point. Like everyone felt the pain. They're like, hey, I can't pay $40 to do $100 transaction. So it was actually the big ordinals were a Bitcoin crypto kitties moment from 2017.
Amazing. Amazing. And that demonstrated the expressiveness of the platform, but also made L2s an absolute requirement if anyone wanted to use it. It wasn't a
At this,
choice,
it
right?
wasn't choice. And at this point, when the developers were coming, there was a community of developers that we seeded. There were developer tools that they could play with. Maybe not as mature as Ethereum, but they're there, right? So it's something that you can work with, and a community that actually welcomes developers with open arms. So I started getting a lot of credit for almost like being the voice of Bitcoin L2s. That hey, this is a category. This is how we're going to behave. Like we're the pie is too small to have infighting, even if different projects are starting. Let's just focus on growing the pie for Bitcoin L2s for everybody. And I think that's actually helping, because now I almost feel like, personally, of course, I'm extremely bullish on Stacks, and I think Stacks is going to be the leading L2. But part of me almost feels like the cat is out of the bag. Some project is going to make it big in the Bitcoin category, because there are enough different designs happening and enough capital flowing that it's just a matter of time, right? Like it's like something is actually going to solve the right problems in the right way.
I agree with you, and I think it's very exciting. And it's really interesting to point to ordinals as a sort of a forcing function, you know, to change some of the attitudes. I also think your point about, it's not always about changing the minds of the old guard. It's about bringing in the new guard. And your approach
Yeah.
of let's go recruit a next wave of people who are excited about our vision, and maybe that'll be a bigger group than the group that's trying to protect an old vision. And what's so exciting to me about it is that the old vision is still important. Bitcoin as stable, slow, reliable, steady, not slow, but simple. I think that vision is still there, but there's also this new vision that you can paste on top. So it feels like a really exciting moment, and maybe that's a good opportunity to kind of bring us back to the beginning. So when we got excited about Bitcoin in 2012, it was to be the basis for you know global internet scale applications of all kinds. And when you started One Name back in 2014, it was very much an internet centric vision of Bitcoin more than a finance centric vision of Bitcoin, starting with identity. And here we are 10 years later. The landscape has changed, the tooling has changed. It's so much more possible than it ever was. And so it's a really interesting moment to think about what do we think is next, and what do we think it's going to look like, or what might it look like? And it reminds me that we're often so surprised by what we think is going to happen and then what actually happens. So, we're thinking about global payments, and we have, meme coins, right? And I think that was sort of a surprise. Or even, looking at a decentralized Instagram and meme coins as sort of an alternative, of that. So I'm very open to the idea that we might be totally surprised by what comes next. Um, but I'm curious to hear from you, like at this moment, now that the table is set, what are you most excited about? What are you most looking forward to? Where are your hopes for the next 5 or 10 years in this ecosystem?
In the short term, I would say the most exciting thing is almost seeing it come back full circle, right? In the sense that things are coming back to the mothership, right? Like you mentioned, you guys got excited about Bitcoin back in 2012 or so. You're one of the earliest investors in Coinbase, and literally this year, Coinbase integrated the first Bitcoin L2 Lightning, right? You would have thought they would have done it maybe the next year or something, like right after the launch of Lightning,
Right.
but no, it took a very long time. I think it's like everything's sort of like coming back to the mothership, And I mentioned, there are some liquidity and other reliability challenges with Lightning. So I would be extremely excited to see if, Stacks Nakamoto gets integrated, and then people can really see fast Bitcoin payments at any volume. Like you want to send hundreds of millions of dollars, to do it, right? So I think those types of integrations, like even between exchanges, like imagine the Bitcoin UX. Whenever you withdraw your Bitcoin from an exchange, you
Right.
sort of like go away. You know it's going to take an hour or more, so people are now used to it. But giving people a different sort of like experience of Bitcoin, and then even from the early days of Bitcoin, there was this idea that Ethereum and these other places are for fast, rapid experimentation, and whenever things find product market fit, those ideas will come to Bitcoin. So a very, very clear example of that is, stable coins have product market fit. So many stable coin transactions happen on so many networks. But now imagine that, let's say Tether does a lot of stable coin transactions on Tron. Like nothing against Tron, but they have their own security model. That's what's securing those stablecoin payments. If Tether is now running on Stacks L2, as soon as you do a payment, it's fast, cheap, it goes through. As soon as a Bitcoin block comes, now your stablecoin payment is backed by 100% of Bitcoin security. Like that's the power of the decentralized internet, right? Like it's as hard to reverse a Bitcoin L1 transaction as it is to reverse your $1 stablecoin payment, right? And I think that's very exciting. That vision of the world is like very exciting to me. So in the short term, I think basically proven ideas, like even decentralized stable coins, but now backed by BTC capital, because BTC is the more stable, less risky, pristine capital. So maybe that can back decentralized stable coins. So that's the short term things that I'm very excited about. But in the long term, I think what what sort of like excites me is most of the developers are still outside of our industry right now, right? And as you said, Bitcoin has the biggest brand name. Bitcoin has the most amount of capital. So when these developers start learning about, okay, I need to come and build something here, hopefully we can work on really good tooling with we have some plans of expanding into other mature languages like potentially Rust and so on. And I think giving those developers exposure to Bitcoin, which is something they've already heard of, they sort of maybe trust more than other things. I think that could enable a huge influx of new developers into our industry. And then these developers are going to build stuff that we have sort of like never heard of.
And those are two really different stories, but they come together. One is the idea that Bitcoin and Bitcoin L2s could become sort of the production environment for blockchain apps. It was one way of thinking of it, right? Secure,
Yeah.
where you go to take something that has been experimented with maybe somewhere else, and you're sort of deploying it for real. And then the idea that there's still most of the developers in the world that aren't building on this stack at all yet is 100% true. So I think both of those things coming together paints a potentially really big picture. Maybe to bring it back a little bit further to the beginning, right? We're still talking about money. We're still talking about moving Bitcoin. There's a whole lot out there that's not money on the internet. I think identity and sort of a self-sovereign identity, a username, if you will, for the internet that you control, that has access to this new decentralized internet, is still a very exciting idea. And I'm hoping that that's where we're headed kind of with everything ultimately. Do you still see that coming? Or are you still, as focused on that kind of outcome as you were 10 years ago?
I think where sort of like my role has evolved. Like obviously, I run one company in the decentralized Stacks ecosystem, but sometimes my role is now to start small experiments and help people and help sort of like new founders run at problems and sort of like guide them. So I do think there are very interesting work happening in both the Bitcoin backed usernames and identity systems, like a work that our company is doing. It's called Orange Domains. It's pretty interesting. Looking back 10 years, that thesis that if you build something on Bitcoin, it will last is actually showing to be more true. If you remember Namecoin, that has completely disappeared. That blockchain is like non-functional at this point. There are also other smaller chains that tried doing domain names, which have pretty much like disappeared. I think stuff on Ethereum still lives, but stuff on Bitcoin absolutely lives, right? So I think there's data point now that if you're building a global username system, you want to build it on the chain that is going to last the longest, right? And I think there's more data to prove that now than before. And one thing that you were talking about, like this slow hunch, right? That sometimes the ideas are not clear. And then you experiment, right? Like you try a few things and then things become more clear. And I've started doing this thing recently where whatever is the clearest description of a strategy or an idea, like I try to sort of like write it down. I'll give you some examples, right? I think it was a year and a half back when the marching orders to some of my team members were that we need to create Bitcoin L2s as a category. Like forget about telling people about what Stacks is or what we do. It's a different thing, right? Like forget about us, right? Like we need to go and create a category. And I think that has a profound impact on the whole ecosystem and actually trying to create this category. Another line was, you need to break the L1 to make L2s happen. So the more traffic goes to the L1 and the fees that go up. So it's an interesting line that you need to break the L1 to make the L2s happen. And I think as a strategy, it's actually very clear when you tell people. So whatever sends more traffic to the L1 is actually great for us, right? When people are doing meme coins on L1, amazing. Let's support them in our explorers and APIs and dev tooling and so on. But these things are not clear, right? Like when you're in it, when you're experimenting with things, they become more clear when you sort of like look back. Um, and even when dealing with some of these old guard of Bitcoin, I think one sort of like summary line that we have was like neutralize the OGs and focus on the new blood, right? So we're not going to fight them. We're just going to sort of like neutralize them, like as if that they're you know you're not actively fighting them, you're not actively trying to convince them. I think there was a time when we were trying to convince them, we were trying to argue with them, right? So you just neutralize them, put them to the side almost, and then focus on the new blood. And I think that has been a very effective sort of like strategy as well. So there are many examples of this, right? Like where you're going through the slow hunch and then things are more clear in hindsight once something worked and then you were able to describe it in sort of like a sentence.
I love that. That's beautiful, and I think it's totally spot on and exactly the kind of things I'm so excited to explore here. And the last one about don't try to convince the old guard, but try to convince the new generation is something that we believe deeply at USV. I think it's like a core part of our theory of change across everything. Um, and it's really interesting that that became clear, as a strategy, as part of all this. Well, I think we have covered as much as we can cover today, and we've sure covered a whole lot of ground, at least 10 years, maybe 30 or 40 years of internet history here. It also feels like we're really just at the beginning of the whole entire chapter here. I personally feel really energized to see it unfold. It seems like you feel that way too. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here with me today. Always enjoy our conversations, and I'm just so impressed by your commitment to a set of ideas that are so big and so profound, and hearing your story of seeing them through over the last 10 years has been really incredible. So thanks, Muneeb.
Awesome. No, this is really exciting, and I think if there's like one forward-looking thought I would want to leave people with, it's I think the new, just like 10 years back, there was a Vitalik school of thought and a Muneeb school of thought, right? Like, hey, do you want to go out start a different chain which is more complex versus build on the base layer? I think the new version of that today, assuming Bitcoin L2s are taking off, is going to be, I think the Vitalik version is, can a app platform that gets a lot of usage leads to internet money, which is ETH. That a lot of people use it. ETH is everywhere. It becomes internet money. Or I think Muneeb's school of thought is you start with money, Bitcoin, and then you can build a very large application ecosystem on top of it, right? So it's almost I think it's the inverse in a way. So I'm betting that it's important to get the money part right, like Bitcoin is money, and then you can build a thriving app ecosystem on top with BTC as money.
That's deep. I love it. All right. Thank you so much, Muneeb. I really appreciate it. Great to see you. And yeah, thank you again.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.